Hey there, welcome to another episode of Monday Moments, the show in which we take a deep dive into Sunday's sermon. With me is Pastor James, continuing our sermon series on the heart of Freedom Fellowship. Thank you so much for tuning in. Before we get started, be sure to hit that subscribe button and the little bell icon next to it to be notified every time we upload a new episode. And without further ado, let's jump into it.
Awesome.
So, this past Sunday, you spoke on simplicity.
Yeah.
And if you're just now joining us, our sermon series has been on the heart of freedom. Now, on staff, we kind of refer to that as our non-negotiables.
Yeah.
And in the corporate world, you might hear that as core values, core principles, core beliefs, so on and so forth. And it's just the principles by which we operate and do ministry. But I think what's cool about this series is that it's not just information about Freedom Fellowship Church and how we do things, but it's also how these principles can apply to our everyday life and give us kind of a framework by which to live, some of these biblical principles, biblical standards, and that sort of thing. And so you talked about simplicity, the simplicity of the gospel. Paul saying, I determined not to preach with clever words or lots of information, and I'm paraphrasing, but just preach Christ and Christ crucified. And then you also kind of took that into the direction of here's how a simple gospel compels us to live simple lives. And so, in our home group last night, we had lots of really good discussion about that and why that's so impactful, but also at the same time can be quite challenging. Yeah. And so I guess my first question is kind of a basic one, and that is, why do you think God made the gospel so simple?
So knee-jerk response is because we're pretty simple. I think that we tend to gravitate towards complexity in everything that we do. I think that we're just kind of designed that way. Like how can we take this and how can we complicate it? And yet, the gospel, it's the simplest story. Like, there was a break in our relationship with God when sin came in, and God wanted to find a way to restore that. And the way that he restored that obviously was by the coming of Jesus and by Jesus' sacrifice. And I think that honestly, like, the simplicity of it, I think it frustrates us at times. Like, we want it to be more complicated than that. Because we want to feel like we had a part of it. Like, we want to feel like somehow our contribution to this process is what made salvation possible. And yet the reality is that it is wholly dependent upon him. And it's just a gift. And
I think sometimes those gifts are hard for us to receive.
Sure.
And it's, at least in my life, it's a prideful thing. And I think that's probably pretty common to all of us, is that, no, we want to have a part in this. Let me pay for part of this fill in the blank. If we go out to eat and, somebody offers to pay for our meal, no, let me pay for it. You know, we kind of have that struggle of just receiving, even though it's the free gift of God.
Yeah. It's so undeserved.
Right.
And it's so extravagant. Right. And I don't think that we can even really comprehend that. I think that we're going to be so surprised when we get to heaven to see how much more extravagant it even is than we can come up with on our own mind. And I think about my own kids when it gets time to, when their birthdays are coming around or when Christmas is coming around, and maybe there's that one thing that they really, really want. And even on a human level, like, they will up their behavior, they will up their obedience, they will do extra things around the house in an effort. It's the same thing. It's in an effort to be worthy of what is being given, and in an effort to try to tip my hand to be more generous. And this idea that God gave the greatest gift that could have ever been given, and he gave it solely based upon his love for us, and not in one iota based upon our effort. I mean, how can I ever, like, really comprehend that without without there being any part of it that was based on me. Like I think that's the complexity of the simplicity of what God did.
Yeah. And I think that starts to paint the picture in our minds and helps us to grasp even a little bit when you hear someone use the phrase the scandal of grace.
Yeah.
And really how scandalous it was that God went through all of this.
Yeah.
Knowing that we were his enemies, we couldn't pay anything back, we couldn't do anything to earn it.
Yeah.
It's just a free gift.
Yeah.
And we talked about last night, the simplicity of the gospel makes it to where it transcends language, culture, time periods. I mean, all of that. I mean, it is relevant for this and any generation, past or future.
Yeah.
And that's really kind of the inherent beauty of it, is that you don't have to reframe it for a new generation, or a different culture or a different language.
Yeah.
And so it really is a universal truth. Well, you mentioned we tend to want to gravitate towards complexity. So it's kind of ironic in asking this question, why do we struggle with simplicity?
Well, I think that we struggle with simplicity because we want to think that, again, we want to think that there was something that can be done to be earned. And then I think that the other side, if we look at that from one perspective, but then we look at it from simply kind of this fleshly perspective, is we tend to look for the loopholes. Like Paul says this. Paul says, "I die daily." He talks about sacrificing his flesh, and here's one of the greatest apostles. And the most prolific writer of the New Testament, wrote more letters, and was really one of the main framers of the church. And his own confession was that he continued to struggle with the lust of the flesh. Like there were things, he says those words, there were things that I did that I don't want to do, and the things that I wanted to do I didn't do. And he says, "Oh, wretched man that I am." And then he gives this beautiful clarification, which really deals exactly with what we're talking about. "Oh, but for the grace of God."
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes the complexity with which we do things, one, we want to feel like we were a part of it.
Yeah.
And so we put these stipulations like, well, you can have this if your life looks like this, or the reason that you don't experience this is because you're not doing the right things, or you're not praying with whatever those things are. And we take all of these things and we say, well, yeah, it's grace plus my efforts, or grace plus great faith.
Yeah.
And Jesus comes and he just kind of dismantles those arguments. He says, hey, look, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you could tell this mountain. Now, I don't think he was saying you could, like, anybody that has that amount of faith is going to tell a mountain to get up and cast itself into the sea. I think his intent was saying, look, everybody has enough faith in order to receive this, but you have to receive it. And I think that's the part of the complexity. Why do we gravitate towards complexity? Because it is hard to receive something that I am so undeserving of.
Right.
That I will always gravitate towards trying to find a way to justify some of my actions as being a part of the value.
Yeah.
So
it makes me think of a lot of things, but specifically the thing that comes to mind is the interaction between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And how the prophets of Baal, when they were trying to pray to their God to consume the altar with fire, they started at, if it's a dial, let's say they started at a 5, and then they started dialing it up, right? They started, chanting and shouting louder and more complex and more words and more actions and more this and more that. And Elijah comes in and prays to the one true God in a very simple prayer, and it was immediate.
Yeah.
The fire of God fell. And I think that sometimes we feel like we've got to do more in order to kind of conjure up this sort of mountaintop
Yeah,
experience.
I've got to convince God
Right.
to do what he promised to do. And if I have to convince God, it means that he's not sovereign.
Right.
It means that he's not true to his word. If it is a free gift of eternal life, if it is a free gift of his unconditional love, if it is a free gift of his beyond understanding peace, then it means that there can't be anything else that's required other than for me to receive it. But yeah, I want to feel like I was a part of it. Like I want to ramp it up. I want to do those things. I want to get better around Christmas time.
Yeah.
In hopes that I can kind of tip his hand towards my favorite.
Make it on the nice
That's
list.
right.
Yeah.
It's move my way into that category.
And I think it was to Moses that God said, in quietness and trust is your strength. Not in the fancy words or the showiness or the good deeds. It's in quietness and trust. Trust in who? Trust in God and who he is. So if we're finding ourselves in this place of complexity, how do we go from complicated to simple? What are some steps that we can begin to take?
Yeah, I love, and we talked about it a little bit yesterday, but I love when they asked Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus goes beyond the answer. He says, well, first and foremost is to love God. And he says, and the second is to love one another. And he says, in doing this, you will fulfill all of these things. I think that the challenge is that oftentimes I don't consider my love for God and God's love for me before I answer things. And so I answer things from my own experience. I answer things from my own knowledge. And I'll admit, like I'm just as guilty of this. Like I will get into a situation and I won't consult. It's like maybe it's a situation I've been in before. And I look at it, I'm like, I got this, and so I'll get into that situation and I'll respond the way that I did last time that might have been successful, and all of a sudden maybe it doesn't have the desired outcome. And I realize, maybe part of it was that I didn't just ask the Lord. And I love that's what Jesus says when asked about the Sabbath. He says, I just do what I see the Father doing. And I think that's too simple sometimes. And I think that sometimes we don't think that God cares about those things. Yeah. And so we don't consult him.
Right.
We think, well, I don't want to, this doesn't rise to the level of needs God's input. Like I know enough about these things that I can do all of this different stuff. And I think that the Bible gives some clarity when it comes to, hey, should extreme example, should I murder this person or not?
Right.
I don't need to go before God and ask, hey, do I need to do this? Because I know God's character and I know God's heart, and I can respond to something like that. But I think that when any time there's this question in our heart, it's like, okay, so what should I do in this? Jesus just looked up and he's like, Father, what would you do in the midst of all of this? And I think, again, one of the things that is so valuable is in the way that we read Christ's words. Mm-hmm. So when Jesus Christ says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, we can look at that as a charge against us, or we can look at it from this very beautiful picture of Jesus saying, look, if you really love me, if you're really in that kind of a relationship with me, well, the most natural thing to come out of you is going to be obedience to these things. And so I think that the complication comes when we stop looking to how would God handle these things, and we begin to really rely on our own ways. One of the prophets in the Old Testament, he says this, God essentially speaking to his people, you thought I was just like you. And honestly, there's a lot of times that I realize that my response probably sounds a whole lot more like me than it does like him. But I assume that I'm doing what he's called me to do without ever acknowledging him.
Yeah. Well, a friend of mine and I were talking about King Saul after the service yesterday, and we were just kind of noting how some of the things that caused King Saul's downfall was that he quit inquiring of the Lord.
Yeah.
And he wanted to please people.
Yeah.
He wanted to please people rather than God. And that was what eventually led to him losing the throne.
Yeah.
Right. And God removing him, or, anointing David. And so it's really does, to your point, come back to this simple, are we inquiring of the Lord on a daily basis? And not to check off some religious boxes. I inquired of the Lord today. Got it.
Yeah.
It's just that simple relationship component in that relationship.
Yeah, and like you talk about with Saul, I mean, it was Saul even saw some of the things that he did as honoring to the Lord. When he brought all of the animals back, that Samuel had told him, you need to wipe out everything. He brings all this back, and Samuel goes, "What is this? What is this that I hear?" And Saul's response was, "I brought the best back in order to sacrifice to the Lord." The problem was that wasn't what the Lord had asked him to do. And I think that sometimes that's where things get complicated. We think that we know a better outcome than what God has asked us to do. And rather than just being obedient to that, we complicate it by coming up with lots of excuses. Well, it's actually better that I bring these sacrifices. And that's that famous scripture from Samuel. Obedience is better than sacrifice. And that can be a tough thing. Because I would rather sacrifice. I would rather make it seem like I gave something up rather than just being obedient to, in this case, just receiving what the Lord has for me.
Absolutely. Well, that's good. Well, I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to dive into Sunday's sermon. Thank you so much for watching another episode with us. If you haven't had a chance to watch this past Sunday's sermon or join us from Sunday, you can do that right here on our YouTube channel. As always, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.